Je vous présente Chris Salter. Chris va faire une introduction, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah. Okay. So, good morning. I'm now we switch into English. Chris Salter. I'm the director of Hexagram Concordia. You see, Hexagram UCAM is also part of the sponsors of this conference. I'm also an associate professor of digital arts or computation arts at Concordia. I have a very odd background, trained in economics, philosophy, theater, and computer-generated sound. But theater and music have always been the key aspect of my research and my artistic work. I trained with Karl Weber at Stanford, who was an assistant of Bertolt Brecht, and actually before that studied with Jeffrey Reeves, who was a longtime associate of Peter Brooks. So that's the background I came from in terms of my training. Then in the 1990s, after directing my own theatrical work, which was much more in the European avant-garde, started to work in Europe with directors like Peter Sellers and Peter Stein, and then eventually 3 years with Billy Forsythe at the Ballet Frankfurt, and then left the theater entirely and started working in the more performance context with new technologies. And then I'm the author of this book, Entangled, which will sit on the book stand in the back, which looks at a history of technology and performance from 1876 until 2009. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, how to ground what you may think of as this strange new thing of Ars Numérique coming from the moon, but actually to show you that this is grounded very deeply in the history of the performing arts.
Donc, Electra est un festival que j'ai fondé en 1999. En fait, la structure qui supporte Electra se nomme ACREC, qui veut dire Association pour la création et la recherche électroacoustique du Québec. Ce fut une association fondée en 1978 par des compositeurs québécois qui évoluaient en musique électroacoustique. Donc, la plupart des activités étaient des concerts de haut-parleurs notamment, et tranquillement, de plus en plus, le domaine du multimédia s'est installé à travers les diverses activités du groupe. Je suis devenu directeur en 1993 en tant que compositeur, aimant beaucoup travailler avec des artistes visuels. Donc, j'ai ramené en force l'aspect visuel qui était considéré à l'époque par les compositeurs musiciens comme étant une façon de combler les faiblesses de la musique, ce que je croyais comme étant le contraire, évidemment. Donc, ce qui nous a amené à créer le festival Electra. Donc, vous avez ici différentes, par exemple, la salle de l'usine C. Nous étions basés dans cette salle. Je crois que vous êtes allés jeudi soir voir un spectacle. C'est une salle multifonctionnelle, merveilleuse, dans le sens qu'on pouvait créer une boîte noire à l'intérieur. Donc, c'était, disons, l'équipement culturel idéal pour justement présenter les arts numériques, mais en performance. Et donc, notre mission est carrément de présenter l'art numérique sous toutes ses formes, et on s'attache évidemment à l'aspect expérimental des musiques et tout ce qui se retrouve autour de la musique, que ce soit du visuel, de la robotique, etc., etc. Donc, une autre vue de la salle de l'usine C. La Biennale, donc, que j'ai fondée il y a 2 ans, la Biennale je considérais que le volet installation en art numérique méritait d'avoir une plateforme beaucoup plus sérieuse. Donc, j'ai fondé la Biennale internationale d'art numérique qui se déploie à travers Montréal dans un registre très large de lieux, que ce soit les grands musées, musées des beaux-arts, musées d'art contemporain, les galeries, les centres d'artistes, jusqu'aux maisons de la culture. Donc, la première biennale, le thème était Phénomène, Phénoména. On a eu 40 000 spectateurs, en incluant les œuvres qui étaient disséminées à la fois dans les galeries, musées et à l'extérieur. La deuxième biennale, celle qui va commencer le 30 avril, le thème est Physical/IT, Physical pour des œuvres faisant référence, utilisant le physique, le corps, physicalité, donc rendre matériel l'immatériel, rendre visible l'invisible. Ici, vous avez, j'ai des programmes ici, donc vous avez l'image qui représente la deuxième biennale. Expérience, donc je pense qu'on peut caractériser les arts numériques par ce mot, expérience.
This is the interesting thing about experience. It's an interesting place to start to think about the manner in which the performing arts, music, opera, theater, dance, and even visual arts moving into the art galleries in the performing arts moving into the art galleries in the 1960s. Because experience in French is both experiment and experience. And it's very interesting to think about the early part of the 20th century where movements like futurism, constructivism, the Bauhaus, the work of people like Moholy-Nagy or Erwin Piscator or even Brecht started to talk about ideas like experiment, laboratory. There was an embrace of science and technology at that time. In fact, the 1923 first exhibition of the Bauhaus was Art and Technology, a New Unity. That was in 1923. So there was already the idea of this imagination of new kinds of spaces which would transform the passive viewer into an actor, right, into an active participant, an active experiencer. In other words, they would no longer sit back and watch what was on the stage, but indeed would actually be plunged into this new technological reality which all of these artists were trying to grapple with at the time. Of course, that technological reality was industrialism. It was the change into an industrial age of machines versus our technical reality, which is an age of the digit, right, or the computation. But it's very interesting if you think back to Piscator. One of his quotes that when he was working on designing these huge machineries, right, treadmills, giant screens, filming actors and then projecting them back onto the stage while those performers were on stage. He said, we have to make use of these complex machineries if we're actually to show modern processes on the stage. So in other words, you know, how do you grapple with the processes, the technical processes of your time, and then essentially put those into the framework of a cultural practice?
Donc, Chris et moi, on a basé notre présentation beaucoup sur le livre que Chris a écrit. Et tous les exemples que je vais vous montrer sont issus du Festival Electra, sauf un seul qu'on voulait montrer, mais il manque d'argent. Donc, on commence par l'écran performant, Performing Screen. Je vous montre quelques exemples. Ici, un compositeur de Montréal, Louis Dufort, Yann Breleux. Est-ce que je peux avoir du son, s'il vous plaît? Ryoshi Ikeda, C4I. Toujours Ryoshi Ikeda, Datamatics, toujours à l'usine C. Herman Colgan, un artiste montréalais, Dust. Même artiste, Inject. fausse technologie. Donc, ici, je passe de l'écran simple à l'écran panoramique. Donc, les premières expérimentations qu'on faisait au début, en 1999-2000, en synchronisant plusieurs écrans. Donc, fausse technologie que j'ai réalisée avec mon collègue Yann Breleux, au Musée d'art contemporain, au Châtelet à Paris, en Italie. Ici, peut-être qu'on peut faire un commentaire. C'est une œuvre, je dirais, classique, culte, qu'on a présentée plusieurs fois à Montréal. Donc, Motion Control Model 5 de ce duo Granular Synthesis, duo autrichien et allemand. You have we can, from here,
Yeah.
je pense qu'on peut parler de l'écran performant, l'écran spectacle. Si
I mean,
on veut.
what's interesting again is so probably the first thing you're wondering is, well, these are just images. There's no bodies. This seems to take the body away. Again, this is a long tension that's gone on in the performing arts between. Yeah, can you hear me? Between this relation between the image and the physical form in front of you. But it again began early on in the end of the 19th century. Already in Germany, they were trying to stage Wagnerian spectacles, and so they decided to use, of course, changing colors of lights, Hugo Baire's kind of rotating wheels to create these kinds of changing projections. And part of that was trying to represent nature in a moving manner, right? Of course, because Wagner was very interested in this kind of natural mythology. But suddenly, when you came to the 1920s, particularly in Russia, you had this shift because suddenly cinema came into place, right? And so, again, audiences and creators were grappling with this new media, right? That was cinema at the time. And so, for instance, the Russian theater director, Vsevolod Meyerhold, said, we have to cinefy the stage, right? We have to basically, he said, use every technical means at our disposal to work with film so the audiences that are watching this will become aware of these new media at the time. And so you had then, over the course of the 20th century, a continual play between performers and their digital or their virtual or their projected doppelganger, on behind them or in front of them or around them. And then what's quite interesting is in the 1960s, especially here, in fact, in Montreal at the Expo 67, you suddenly had the move toward performative events where there were no bodies. But indeed, they were called performances. People sat down and watched for 10 to 15 to 20 minutes a sudden event that took place on a surface, on a screen. So, for instance, the most famous is Joseph Svoboda's work at the Czech Pavilion in 1967 here. Most of you probably know the Laterna Magica that performed in Prague, which was with live actors and then projection. But Svoboda's work here at the Czech Pavilion was about basically giant screen-based systems, the polyecran and the diapolyecran, which were performers. So the most famous is the diapolyecran, which was a 200, you might call them pixels, but essentially panel surface that each of these panels was actually a box that had two slide projectors, and these things could move back and forward in relief. And essentially what you had is a pixelated display controlled by a computer tape of 160,000 instructions that would essentially, in 10 minutes, present the birth of the world. So you had this birth of the world, and essentially what happened was you were watching essentially a live performer which consisted only of this surface. And so the work that Alain is showing is, again, a kind of continuation of that work from the 60s with current technologies.
Oui, je pense qu'on pourrait aussi caractériser les œuvres qui sont issues justement du domaine des arts électroniques, des arts numériques, comme, bon, il y a beaucoup de recherches sur les relations image-son, mais aussi au niveau du contenu, donc des œuvres qui sont non narratives comparativement au cinéma. Donc,
Yep.
Je vais vous montrer d'autres exemples. Donc, ce classique Motion Control Model 5, qui était une réelle expérience physique assez extraordinaire. Est-ce que je peux avoir un petit peu plus de son sur l'ordinateur, s'il vous plaît?
You know, it's interesting with granular synthesis. It's been described. This work, motion control, was described as a kind of virtual opera, right? Because you have these 4 images of Akemi Takaya, Japanese performer living in Austria, who was photographed doing all sorts of singing and moving of the head, and then that was in real time, originally actually controlled by 2 tape machines. Later it was going on to computer, but the early 4 basically out of sync with one another. And so what you do is create this essentially this kind of virtual opera, because the sounds you get are also coming from her.
C'est ça, ils avaient un switcher vidéo homemade. C'était pas comme ça pendant 45 minutes, mais ça vous donne une bonne idée. Mais c'était aussi une réelle expérience physique, parce que derrière les écrans, il y avait un mur de ce qu'on appelle des subwoofers, des haut-parleurs sur grave, là, si on veut. Et puis on pouvait littéralement, je pouvais sentir littéralement l'air entre en tout cas ma jambe et mon pantalon, ou l'air qui poussait dans mes narines. C'était vraiment très spécial. Donc, c'était vraiment une pièce marquante, une expérience. Une autre pièce qu'on a présentée, qui était, elle, issue d'un shooting que Granular Synthesis avait fait avec la performeuse Diamanda Gallas, la performeuse américaine. Donc, toujours à l'usine C, 1999, on s'excuse à cette époque-là. Donc, cette pièce, elle a été faite après Motion Control Model 5. Donc, il y avait un désir d'immersion, si on veut, encore plus grand.
What's interesting also about this work, Paul, so it features Alain said, the body and the face of Diamanda Gallas. And when Diamanda saw the first version, she was a bit shocked and said, "Oh, that doesn't look like me." So that the technique had actually totally transformed, which is very interesting, because if you listen to Diamanda Gallas, who has a 5-6 octave vocal range, when you hear her sing, you also wonder if this is a human singing, or something else, something from another dimension. So it's very interesting that when she saw the visage, when she saw the image of herself, that shocked her. But when you listen to her as an audience, you're also completely thrown into another space. It doesn't feel like a human. So.
Donc, c'était 1999. On passe donc toujours l'écran spectacle, le son, mais avec le performeur sur scène. Donc, quelques exemples de performances qu'on a présentées chez Electra, Atom. Voilà. Donc, l'écran immense. Ryoji Ikeda. Frank Brettschneider du label Rasternoton. Moi-même avec Yann Breleux, mais dans ce cas-ci, pas devant l'écran, mais de chaque côté de l'écran. Voilà. UVA de Londres. Light Surgeon. Donc, l'utilisation d'écrans multiples, mais avec performeur sur scène. Carsten Nicolai. Donc ici, utilisation du projecteur aussi comme source lumineuse vers les spectateurs.
It's interesting here because, in a way, you have the intersection of two different historical practices. So, one is the club scene and techno, right, where, of course, you see the DJ as the performer, and, of course, you have virtuoso DJs from Grandmaster Flash to Kraftwerk to you name it. So, in a way, the performer is front and center, even though you see all the intricate motions of the turntable. But at the same time, you also, again, interestingly enough, have the theater coming into place. And there's actually an interesting quote from the 1940s, 1941, from Robert Edmund Jones, an American scenographer, who said, in the future, some kind of new playwright will presently set a motion picture screen on stage above and behind his performers, and will reveal the two worlds of the conscious and the unconscious. This is 1941. So.
Oui, parce que, évidemment, dans ce type de performance, les gens questionnent beaucoup qu'est-ce que le performeur fait sur scène. Est-il vraiment utile? Car je crois que l'audience, à un moment donné, a besoin de voir un ou des humains.
Yeah, I mean, it's also going again even further back. Piscator said in the 1920s, he said, someday the technicians will be just as important on stage as the actors. And this is, of course, a director who was famous for working with actors, right? So it wasn't, again, the actors are not important anymore, but it's to say, as these technical systems come onto the stage, there's going to be a shift in perception. And so those technical performers, and of course everybody knows this, you see from the Worcester Group to John Jesserin to performers, directors working with video, where those technicians increasingly became part of the mise en scène. Already that was situated in back in the 1920s as one realized that these technical processes are not just transparent and hidden, but indeed part of the event.
Ce qui est intéressant avec le prochain exemple une pièce récente de Carsten Nicolai, c'est que l'interface visuelle devient le contenu. Donc, ça fut présenté en 2012 au Musée d'art contemporain dans le cadre de la Biennale. Continuer d'autres exemples ici. Koichi Kurokawa, une œuvre triple écran HD verticaux qui se nomme Réo. Dans ce cas-ci, Kurokawa aime beaucoup travailler avec des sources filmées provenant de la nature et qui sont transformées. Un duo québécois, Denis Perrault, Thomas Frédéric. Donc, un travail avec triple écran et 8 téléviseurs.
I mean, this piece that Alain just showed is quite interesting because it invokes both this tension between the monitor, the television monitor, and the screen. And that's another interesting history in the performing arts, starting in the end of the 1950s, because increasingly the television screen, 1963, 1964, television screens started to end up in galleries, like Namjoon Pike, for instance. And then in the late 1960s, theater directors started to incorporate television screens on stage. 1971, in fact, Karl Weber, who I work with, did a production of Peter Handke's Caspar at the Brooklyn Academy of Music for the Chelsea Theater Company. In fact, had rows of screens with live CCTV cameras in the theater on stage. Basically, now, of course, all of this was pre-recorded. There was no way to edit that. There was no real-time manipulation of the signals. But the performer, Christopher Lloyd, had to indeed perform with this, many, many images of himself, again, happening in that space. So, and then at the same time, you have this sense of the image dwarfing the performer. So this is this tension between the screen as television, or screen as a kind of object, versus this environment. And these projects do that all the time.
Et en termes des relations image-son, on voit surtout, par exemple, dans l'exemple de Kirsten Nicolai tout à l'heure, c'est le son qui influence l'image, donc la visualisation du son. Dans ce cas-ci, le son crée... le visuel crée le son. Donc le son est issu du visuel. Ce qui est
and that connection also, again, is not particularly new. Already in the 1960s, most of you know the Kitchen in New York, right? This famous performing arts space. Does anybody know who founded it? Nobody knows who founded the Kitchen, even though it's a really important icon in the performing arts? It was Stena and Woody Vasulka, who were not coming from the performing arts. They were coming from the visual arts. But they founded the Kitchen, and in fact, they set up monitors every week. They had artists coming in who were coming from music, from theater, from the visual arts, and essentially showing work every week, in which the screen became increasingly an important aspect of performing practice. So it's again very interesting that we tend to think, oh, video, that's over in the visual arts. But no, you already see in the 60s there was a seepage going on between these genres we call visual and performing, and now what we call media arts. That was already started, that kind of seepage. It's nothing particularly new.
Une œuvre triple écran que j'ai réalisée avec mon confrère Yann Bredeux, une première à la Place des Arts. Pour cette pièce, donc, les performeurs de chaque côté des écrans, donc on revient à l'idée de l'écran spectacle.
I think it's interesting also to note that indeed now, because of digital technology, this kind of seamless fusion between image and son is made possible, right? In fact, you have, again, this influence at the machine level of how an image is transformed based on the frequency. I mean, essentially images and sounds to a computer are the same thing. They're just digits. And in fact, they're also frequencies. So, of course, you have all these mathematical models to essentially alter one with the other. But I think it's really important to point out here that so much of this work is not just coming from club culture, but is also coming from the histories of music and technology. Think about venues like Stijm in Amsterdam, founded by composers like Jan Boerman and the late Michel Weiswitz. in which there was already this interest in designing instruments and interfaces for performers that would alter both images and sounds in real time. Real time is essentially the speed of the output of the computer equals the speed of the input, right? So in fact, now every machine is real time. Imagine going back 30 years, 32, 40, 33 years, where real time was slow. If you render a video now, that was how sound rendered as well in big mainframe computers. So these musicians at Stein, for instance, were interested in this kind of direct influence. They were trying to basically manipulate sound and later image basically by hard physical interfaces. So this relation between image and sound and the alteration, this kind of, let's say, technical alteration between them was already imagined as technologies became more, let's say, accessible. And there's obviously, in the history of cinema, in the history of avant-garde film, this relationship has always been there. And in a way, now you might say, well, the difference is the digital gives you a certain precision that the analog, which is analogous, right, to something physical, didn't give you, right? And I think, again, to bring up Stena Vasulka, who, of course, is trained as a musician, her early works like Violin Power, she's playing the violin, and she had essentially microphones to alter an analog image in real time. And this is very interesting. This is the 1970s, 1970, 1971. That interest in how one form, one modality of sense, image, could suddenly transform another modality, sound. And you see now this becoming part of a larger cultural practice, which is no longer isolated into a small gallery in New York, but actually is, at Lollapalooza.
Ici, un autre exemple de l'écran spectacle, mais dans un contexte extérieur, art public. Donc, ici, dans le quartier des spectacles, pendant la Biennale, on avait un événement qui s'appelait le parcours numérique. Dans le cas d'Electra, et de la Biennale, nous avons commandé une œuvre à Refik Anadol, qui est un artiste basé à Istanbul. L'extrait que je vais vous montrer, c'est une projection sur le Centre de design de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Présentement, vous avez peut-être vu qu'il y a des projections sur différents buildings dans le quartier. C'est une série de commandes faites autour du travail de Norman McLaren, une collaboration avec l'Office national du film. Donc ici, je vous montre en 2012 Refik Anadol pendant la Biennale. Un exemple. Ici, un autre exemple, le performeur, mais le performeur carrément dans l'écran. Je vous montre l'exemple. 10-24 Architecture, un duo français. Donc, de plus en plus, le désir des artistes de prendre la scène. Ici, un autre exemple, un duo québécois, Nicolas Bernier et Martin Messier, La Chambre des Machines. C'était une pièce, les artistes ont créé leur propre interface. Cette pièce, bon, les interfaces sont beaucoup basées sur les différents instruments qui avaient été créés à l'époque par Luigi Russolo, l'art des bruits, le futurisme et tout ça. Là. Donc,
but I mean, certainly the intermemory of Russolo, but also this interest, again, from the point of view of music, of interfaces, right? Of machines becoming interfaces to images, to sounds, to creating spectacles. And again, most of the histories of the performing arts have always ignored the histories of experiments in musical practice. From the music theater, for instance, of people like Kagel in the 1960s, who also was very interested in creating kind of objects with microphones, and of course Cage being the prime example in a lot of this work is very much
mettre en scène les musiciens.
Ouais, yeah, you know, so this very much this idea of the prepared piano. I mean, Martin Messier and Nicolas Bernier's work is let's say a kind of next generation of that prepared piano, a machine which also is active as an instrument.
Ici, un exemple, 4 musiciens de l'ensemble intercontemporain à Paris, une œuvre de Herman Colgan avec projection. La fameuse Reactable qui a été créée à Barcelone, donc utilisée par... on a eu une performance ici à l'usine C, mais utilisée par Björk, etc. Voilà, un autre type d'interface. Quelque chose d'un peu plus dans la veine do it yourself, DIY, donc Martin Messier avec des machines à coudre modifiées. Voilà. Nicolas Bernier, un projet solo avec des instruments inventés. Frequencies. Gordon Monahan, une performance. Gordon Monahan, la fameuse performance. J'oublie le titre de ça.
Speaker swinging.
Oui, c'est ça.
Speaker swinging.
Donc, 3 performeurs qui font tourner des haut-parleurs. Et ici, la photo, évidemment, il y a une lumière à un moment donné qui s'allume, donc ça fait un très bel effet. Et c'est donc, ils font tourner des haut-parleurs. Gordon envoie certaines fréquences plutôt de type sinusoïdal, et puis il y a l'effet Doppler qui est créé. C'est une très très belle pièce, très demandante pour le performeur sur scène.
Ouais.
Le corps, bodies.
They're coming back now, so bodies are coming back.
Yeah. Quelques exemples de danse. Donc c'était avec le collectif Labo de Bruxelles. Donc, une pièce interactive. « 2006, quand même. Donc, les danseurs avaient un dispositif qui permettait de créer l'image en temps réel sur les écrans. Marie Chouinard. Dans ce cas-ci, c'est une pièce pour écran. C'est un travail avec le compositeur Louis Dufort, ici à Montréal, qui est parti d'une monobande et qui a créé une pièce pour 4 écrans. Et une autre variation de cette pièce qui s'appelle Cantique. Ici, c'était une installation interactive qu'on avait présentée avec écran sensible. Et si on reste dans le domaine de la danse, Je vais là, de Chris Salter, qu'on a présenté à la Place des Arts en 2017. Donc, est-ce que tu veux que je présente l'exemple vidéo et ensuite tu en parles?
This is a performance that I did in collaboration with the American dancer Michael Schumacher, who danced for William Forsythe for a number of years and is really one of the top improvisers in the world.
Peut-être tu peux décrire le système
Yeah,
interactif.
so the idea of the piece, I mean, Schwelle is a German word for threshold. This was actually a 3-part work. The first part was only image and sound, multi-screen. The second part is this performance with live performer, in which the audience sits on 2 sides of the room. This was in at Place des Arts here. It's also shown in Paris at the Exit Festival. And then the last part is an installation for the public without any performer in a dark room. So again, trying to see how different audience configurations in relationship to images, to media, to bodies would work. What happens in the second part is it's exploring the period after the disintegration of the body and before, as the Tibetans talk about, a kind of motion of rebirth. And the idea was how to make a room alive. So the room at times would overwhelm the performer, and at other times it would disappear and the performer would, let's say, move into the foreground. And what happens in the piece is it's a 45-minute work. Essentially, Michael Schumacher is stuck at that table at the end, making small cranes, like in Japan, out of paper. So a very Beckett-like environment where all movement is restricted, and then and the room around him is constantly transforming based on a network of wireless sensors that pick up changes of light and also changes on his body in terms of his movement. He's wearing acceleration sensors. What's very interesting, the thing that everyone has in their iPhone right now or their smartphone that measures the rate of change of velocity, not velocity itself. So what's very interesting about Schumacher, because he worked with Forsythe, he's very aware of acceleration. So sudden shifts that produce very violent changes of movement were explored and played with. And you can see a quick clip here. There's a 24-channel sound system running in the room that creates the sense of a totally different room. So you're always aware that this room is expanding and contracting while this performer is present. And we had to fight very much because he's such a compelling mover to sometimes use the sound to overwhelm the body and at times to make his performance make the room disappear. And that was a very interesting tension we had. So the sounds you're hearing are being produced by his motion right now. For instance, these tiny, small sounds. It's a very quiet piece, except for moments when
Ce qui était intéressant aussi, c'était que la relation, l'interaction entre le danseur et les technologies, c'était pas du un pour un, donc je fais un geste et il se passe quelque chose. C'était beaucoup plus subtil.
And it's also interesting on this piece because most of you know, this kind of scene of dance and technology is always working with images, and we chose not to work with any image. We were just working with light. And what's interesting is light, if you start to think about the relation of a body to a room, to an environment, light has a very different time constant, i.e. temporal shape, than, of course, a moving body does. And it has also a very different temporal shape than sound does. So what's interesting is how these different temporal shapes operate together or interact with each other. So, you have a very slow legato movement, and then you suddenly have this break using those 3,000-watt stroboscopes that have a very, very incredibly sharp bursting quality, which is very, very different than the fluid movements of the body, And so to play with, to think about choreographing, we take the choreographing the body, but to choreograph media along with performers is the way to start to think about these kinds of uses, as opposed to saying, oh, this is just backdrop, or light lights a scene. But no, light is a performer. Light has, but it's a different performer, right? It's a different shape. And so we try to think about light having its own temporal quality in relationship to the temporal quality of the body.
Donc ici, vous avez un extrait d'une performance que c'était pré-Electra, que la CREC avait présentée en 1994 avec le performeur Stellark, le performeur australien. Donc c'était une pièce avec robot, c'était Involuntary Movement, je pense que c'est le titre de la pièce, où Stellark, à partir d'un ordinateur, recevait des voltages sur 5 points de son corps, ce qui créait des mouvements involontaires. Donc, il y avait cette drôle de chorégraphie, plus ou moins en relation avec le robot, plus le visuel et tout ça. C'était quand même quelque chose, ce fait assez marquant pour nous en 1994.
I mean, I want to make a kind of segue here from seeing some of this dance-based work to the suddenly you're confronting these machines moving, which of course are very, very different. I mean, most of you know that in the histories of dance, again, 20th century modern dance, there was an obsession with machines, right? In fact, Isadora Duncan said, I need a motor to move in my body. I have a motor in my body, and that is what compels me to move. And again, the futurists, people like Oskar Schlemmer, were obsessed by not making the body disappear or replacing it with the machine, but by, let's say, extending the body out into the world through some kinds of techniques. Schlemmer did it with poles, right? The famous pole dance, in which the body was extended by poles into space. And even, let's think about Judson Dance Theater in the 1960s, which is absolutely, we would think, anti-technological, very much about the stripping away things and putting the body as the only thing to look at on stage. But even people like Trisha Brown, who were developing at the time, and still is actually, these kinds of dance machines, things she said would take the part of creating choreographies, systems, rules, rigorous structures that would produce choreography movements away from the habits of the performer. So then you suddenly start to see this shift in the kind of work we're looking at now, where these machines move, and this seems to be, the world of science fiction. But again, go back to the 1800s to Kleist's famous essay über das Marionettentheater, where he basically said, well, the machine, the mannequin or the marionette, is actually more supple let's say, has more grace than the human performer. So couldn't we just replace the human performer with the marionette? And Gordon Craig in the 1920s went further, talking about the actor and the uber marionette, also saying machines could have the same force as human beings. They also have interesting movements. They're not the same, but they actually also have a predilection of locomotion, of shaping space, and so on. And then, of course, Jean Tegelet, Homage to New York, I mean, of course, as being the most famous example of a visual artist to put these machines out into a theatrical context. And what did you watch? Well, you watched these machines, these kind of poor, falling apart devices, trying to articulate things. Of course, they have no consciousness, but yet they have kinesis. You know, they have kinetics. They move. And that movement is what causes us to attribute the fact that they feel alive to us.
Ici, un exemple que j'aurais peut-être dû placer plus tard parce que le prochain chapitre sera l'immersion. Mais ce qui est intéressant, vous allez voir, c'est une œuvre de Louis-Philippe de Mers qui s'appelle «L'Assemblée». Le public se trouve au centre, justement, d'une assemblée, entouré de 36 ou 64 bras robotiques. Chacun a son haut-parleur, sa lumière. Quelques-uns ont des caméras vidéo. C'était la finale. Une autre pièce de Louis-Philippe de Mers, de Tyler Girls, qui est justement basée sur ces fameuses danses en ligne qui étaient exécutées à l'époque, notamment à New York, par les Rockets.
Yep.
Donc, je vous montre un exemple. Ici, une performance qu'on a présentée en 99 qui s'appelait Executive Machinery d'un performeur d'origine hongroise qui habitait à Toronto maintenant, Istvan Kantor, son nom d'artiste Monty Kensen. Donc, machine, vidéo, interactivité avec des classeurs. Donc, les tiroirs des classeurs contrôlaient en temps réel des boucles vidéo et audio. Deux ans plus tard, il est venu faire une performance encore très immersive qui s'appelait Sex Machine and Filing Cabinet. Il était obsédé par les classeurs encore à cette époque-là. Une œuvre de Bill Vaughan, qui enseigne ici à l'Université Concordia, aussi un artiste-chercheur d'Hexagram Concordia. Donc, Race State Machine, donc 4 robots, une performeuse qui à la fois contrôle et dialogue avec les machines. Sa dernière pièce, Bill Vaughan, donc DSM-6, une installation robotique, donc avec des robots qui ont des comportements behavior, si vous voulez, basés sur le dernier dictionnaire des maladies mentales, le DSM-6. Ici, Cinétose, un duo montréalais, Simon Laroche et Étienne Grenier. Donc, ce qui est intéressant, c'est une performance sonore avec donc 36 plaques qui sont installées au plafond. Ce qui est intéressant dans cette pièce, c'est qu'elle peut être présentée sur une scène de théâtre en utilisant les systèmes d'accrochage. C'est une performance audio assez spectaculaire avec lumière. Donc ici, on retrouve un peu un aspect de danger. Donc le spectateur qui est en dessous des plaques, s'il veut. Et pendant cette performance de 40 minutes, les plaques descendent. J'ai appris qu'en France, ils ont réussi à les descendre à, je pense, à 1 mètre du sol. C'est chose qu'on n'a pas pu faire ici à Montréal, malheureusement.
This work reminds me of, I mean, this is, you can't see them here, but the students in the Bauhaus had to come up with new kinds of theaters. This is the famous U theater from Farkas Molnar, who imagined the floor where the audience was sitting as a hydraulic system where they would go up and down during the performance. Or the famous Kugeltheater from Weininger, the sphere theater, in which the entire audience would sit around and the performance would happen in a spindle in the center. Or even, of course, this famous thing, the kinetic construction system of Moholy-Nagy, a theater which was a giant like cylinder that you would slide, the performers and the actors would slide down on conveyor belts watching the event take place. So, I mean, again, these are very interesting in this idea that these spaces that you're in themselves are being actuated, are being transformed or performing.
Ici, une pièce plus reliée à un artiste évoluant en art visuel, de Max Dean, de Robotic Chair. Comme vous pouvez voir, c'est une chaise qui est sur une scène. Les spectateurs sont autour et la chaise tombe, elle se défait en 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 morceaux et en 10 minutes, elle se reconstruit toute seule. vais sauter.
And again, because of it moving, you feel empathy or sympathy for this poor piece of furniture.
Et le plus intéressant, c'est que ça fonctionne.
It's interesting that in the 1960s, the German curator Jascha Reichart, who curated the famous Cybernetic Serendipity show at the ICA, which many of these kinds of early robotic performances were being shown, said that in trying to address the question of why do we make these machines feel alive to us, she said that perhaps it's not the appearance of the machine, it's the behavior, right? We look at robots and we tend to think, oh, they have to look like humans, but it's not about the appearance, it's actually what they do, you know, and I think this is a really good example of that.
Voilà. Une autre pièce, une installation d'art sonore, les frères de Coster de Suisse, qu'on a présenté à la fonderie d'Alain. Très belle pièce robotique. Donc, avec un haut-parleur à l'intérieur de chaque tuyau, la machine faisait toute une chorégraphie et le son était aussi en interaction avec la vélocité du mouvement. Une autre pièce robotique qu'on a présentée en 2002, un trio du ZKM, donc le Robot Lab de Jukebox. Il y avait une fascination pour les spectateurs de regarder cette pièce. D'ailleurs, avec les jukebox, on avait fait un concours avec un champion du monde et évidemment l'humain a gagné, ce qui a rassuré tout le monde. Ici, une pièce très fameuse d'Edwin van der Heijden et Marnix Sidenich de Hollande, un haut-parleur qui tourne à 100 km/h. Donc, ce qui est intéressant dans cette pièce, c'est le sentiment de peur qui est créé, à la fois de fascination parce qu'elle est interactive, la pièce, mais à la fois, c'est la peur de recevoir le haut-parleur sur la gueule, en fait. Une autre pièce robotique, Zimoun, un artiste basé en Suisse, qui travaille beaucoup avec toutes ces boîtes et différents dispositifs très low-tech. Il fut présenté à Oboro pendant le biennale. Donc, des pièces très immersives, très belles pièces qu'il fait. Immersion, justement. Voilà. Ici, un exemple. Donc, je commence par des pièces qu'on a présentées, 64 haut-parleurs, de Steve Becker, qui est un artiste canadien, Saskatchewan, qui vit à Montréal. Avec Clicks and Cars, c'était un projet avec un label bruxellois qui utilisait des carrosseries de voitures comme haut-parleurs, donc avec un vibreur en dessous. Le son était transmis au vibreur et la carrosserie devenait le haut-parleur. Donc, le son émanait des haut-parleurs, donc en quadraphonie. Black Box, que j'ai réalisé avec Yann Bruleux en 2003, 4 canaux audio, 4 canaux vidéo. Une autre pièce quand même assez immersive. dans une autre configuration en Italie. Granular Synthesis, donc 360 pour 12 haut-parleurs et 12 écrans. 3 minutes. OK. Donc, je vais passer à N Polytop de Chris.
This piece will be here in Montreal at the beginning of May at the Foundry Darling. So this is actually a reimagining of Ioannis Xenakis' Polytopes from the 1960s and 1970s. This is from Laboral in Spain, which was done in 2012. We're using a machine learning system to drive parts of the compositional structure in terms of light and sound.
White Box en version 360 à la Gaieté Lyrique.
Again, all these works again involve this long interest in the theater, particularly of removing the fourth wall, of putting the audience into the action. It's this example here.
Ryoshi Ikeda de Transfinite qu'on voulait présenter ici à l'Arsenal quand on a fait l'exposition monographique avec DHCA, donc avec John Zepetelli, commissaire à l'époque. On aurait beaucoup aimé présenter cette pièce en parallèle avec l'exposition, mais toujours une question d'argent. Ça se fait présenter à l'Armory Hall à New York. Une autre variation, donc c'est vraiment le désir du spectateur d'être, de ne plus être spectateur justement, de regarder devant lui une œuvre, mais d'être partie prenante de l'œuvre. Ça, c'est un signé. D'autres pièces qui ont été faites avec la SAT, ici, sur Saint-Laurent, ils ont un très beau dôme, donc je crois qu'il y a un programme tous les soirs présentement. C'est une pièce que j'ai réalisée avec Bahia Cardel et fils. Voilà. Edwin van der Heide, LSP avec 2 lasers. Et l'ultime pièce immersive, Fille de Kurtenschläger, qui nous plonge dans une fumée tellement dense pendant 30 minutes, avec une projection stroboscopique. Donc, on part d'une pièce où on est collectivement en train de vivre une œuvre à une expérience singulière. Donc,
This is interesting. This piece is essentially a room of fog with many strobe lights hitting the fog, so you actually have the image on your retina. And of course, everything you see is actually projected by the brain out into the space. But it was commissioned by the Theater Biennale, by the Venice Biennale Theater, when Roberto Castellucci was the artistic director. Castellucci sent out a call to the world asking for pieces dealing with theater and crisis. And he was seeing things all around the world, and that piece was chosen.
Et on va terminer avec GND de Chris Salter.
And this piece is the opposite of Feed. This is for one person at a time inside a totally dark environment, which sound and vibration and light are all operating at the bare thresholds of perception. So you're alone in this box for, I mean, we've shown it in 12 countries around the world, and it varies from 30 minutes to 2 minutes. So.
Voilà. On peut terminer là. Donc, on avait
so
le dernier
last section.
Mais, je peux. Raphaël Lozano-Emer au Musée d'art contemporain, Frequencies and Volume, à la Gaieté Lyrique.
So, to finish up, again, in the history of the performing arts, particularly scenography and theater in the 20th century, the long obsession was to remove the fourth wall, to put the audience in the center of the action, to remove the representation of the picture frame, of which people like Liszewski and Friedrich Kiesler and many, many scenographers wanted to get rid of for so long. And I think Artaud is really the maybe a good way to end. I've been trying to rescue Artaud from this idea that was propagated in the 1960s that Artaud's work was all about the body of the performer only. Of course, that was part of it. The theater of cruelty was about the experience not of something transforming you from without, but from within. And people like Joseph Chaikin and Peter Brook and Eugenio Barbara and, of course, Grotowski in the 60s pushed Artaud as a kind of example of the purity of the actor's body on stage. But if you go back and read Artaud, you realize that what Artaud is talking about is a lot of the kind of work you've seen now, in which the environment, the bodies of the actors, the bodies of the performers, and the bodies of us as spectators are thrown into the spectacle, in which objects and sounds and lights and performers are all participating in this creation of a kind of transformation of us both as makers and as perceivers. So I think that's a good way to end.
Voilà, merci.
So, well, thank you for throwing us into those spectacles. And we're going to open it up for questions, and please just state your name. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Alain, for extraordinary shot in the arm early Saturday morning. So, watching this, immersing in all of this, my sense is that, in fact, the collision of the visual and performing arts have always been there in front of us, with us, around us, and the implications for curation. Is there no longer the necessity of thinking that there is a visual arts curation culture and a performing arts curation culture still to be developed, this notion we had up to now? Is it all really one and the same thing now?
I have an answer, but I'll let
Rapidement, oui et non. Ça dépend toujours des contextes.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because artists are not the ones making those frames. Institutions are making those frames. What constitutes a visual art versus media arts versus performing arts? These are all bullshit. I mean, of course, you have disciplines and you have practices, and painting is different than making music, for sure. And those are deep crafts. But if you look at the development of opera, if you go back to the Greek theater, what is the Greek theater but something which is sung, spoken, where political debate happened, where there was architecture, where there was the environment? The Greek theaters, if you look at the theater of Dionysus, what do you experience? You not only experience the performers down on the stage, you experience the entire landscape of Athens and the natural world. So the mediated world and the natural world have always been mixed together. It's not that suddenly media has been invented in the 20th century. It's not that suddenly the visual arts have appeared and then interfered with the purity of the performing stage. If you go back to the medieval mystery plays, where actors and audiences were moving through cities, were on wagons, were participating in communion to celebrate the stories of the New Testament or the Old Testament, these kinds of things have always been taking place. But institutional frameworks, and it's very interesting with the media arts and the performing arts, because institutions, cultural institutions, are still running on a 19th century model, industrial model, in which you have a season and you have to stamp out things like an assembly line, where you can't completely transform environments based on the particular practice of the particular artists or you're working with. So you're always trapped in this model, of continually repeating. We talk about new technologies and new ways of seeing the world, but our methods are still, in terms of production, the same as essentially 100 years ago.
Avec l'avènement des nouvelles technologies numériques, aussi, les pratiques des artistes sont devenues beaucoup plus hybrides. Donc, c'est sûr que moi, en tant que directeur artistique, j'ai toujours essayé de pousser à la limite ce qui était le contexte, par exemple, du concert. Ça prend 10 ans, mais à un moment donné, les musiciens admettent, oui, c'est intéressant. Et c'est la même chose, je veux dire, par exemple, là, avec la Biennale, on travaille beaucoup avec le milieu de l'art visuel, l'art contemporain. Je sens que ce milieu-là est encore plus de difficultés à admettre l'importance des travaux qui sont faits par les artistes qui utilisent les nouvelles technologies numériques. Il y a beaucoup de résistance encore, donc c'est sûr que mon travail depuis 15 ans a été beaucoup de convaincre les différents milieux de la nécessité de comprendre que l'utilisation des nouvelles technologies était aussi valable que faire de la peinture, jouer d'un instrument de musique ou de danser sur une scène. Donc, oui?
Hello, I'm Alain Sorensen. Yeah, okay. I'm an artist and a blogger and a curator as well. And so I just wanted to thank you guys for this survey of technology and art and stuff. But one thing I found I was missing is, in terms of thematics and all that, is sampling. And I think Chris, thankfully made this historical linkage with the past, with Bauhaus and stuff. And sampling does have a link with the past, with collage and 1980s appropriation art and stuff like that. I was just curious to, why, and there are a lot of people that we can talk within the fields of your creation. For example, Iboman, Girl Talk, and Addictive TV. Peter Greenaway even remixing his own film. So I just want to find out, why did you not put this into your presentation? Sampling, échantillonnage. Yeah.
Disons que, yeah, and je veux dire, la présentation, je l'ai basée sur ce qu'on avait présenté depuis 15 ans chez Elektra. Donc, et aussi, j'ai voulu travailler à partir de certains chapitres thématiques qui étaient dans le livre de Chris pour vraiment créer un lien. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'on est parti de l'écran performant, juste en passant par le corps, la mécanique, les machines et l'immersion. Donc, mais effectivement, donc c'est vraiment un survol. Voilà.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's certainly again part of these trajectories, but we don't want to be all day here. So, thanks.
Hi, my name is Michelle Steinwald. I have a comment and a question. The comment is just you touched on puppeteering and the awareness that puppeteers have of the spirit in movement is something I think would be a really interesting exercise for choreographers to adapt some of their language around. Anyways, that's just my comment. I think that's a really...
Well, I mean, you think about wayang kulit, a Javanese shadow puppet, where you have that intricate relationship between, the shadow puppet and human movement, but also the screen, right? And also this mechanical movement. So it's or bunraku. I mean, it's also this very interesting connection you make.
My question is, as makers and curators, how do you navigate bringing your own work within a platform?
So the question is...
Comme artiste et curateur,
ouais.
Comment vous naviguez?
OK, à travers tout ça.
Oui, à travers tout ça.
Je veux dire, moi, en tant qu'artiste, j'ai envie de faire certaines choses et puis qui m'intéressent. Et ce que je trouve vraiment fantastique en étant curateur, directeur artistique, c'est d'avoir accès à un monde. Donc, de ne pas être juste restreint à ma petite pratique, mais je veux dire, je suis intéressé par tout ce qui se passe. Donc, je veux dire, ça correspond à ma personnalité tout à fait, justement, de pouvoir programmer des artistes, découvrir, être choqué éventuellement par certaines pièces. Mais quand je fais des choix artistiques à l'intérieur soit du festival Elektra ou de la Biennale, je veux dire, il y a peut-être 5 ou 10% des choses que j'aime vraiment, Le reste, je me dis, je sais que c'est important que les gens les voient, les expérimentent. Et puis, c'est toujours de se tenir, comme on dit, on the edge. Là. Donc, qu'est-ce qui se passe maintenant? Qu'est-ce qui est important? Qu'est-ce qui doit être vu?
It's an interesting question because, you know, I grew up both in the kind of proscenium theater and then became more interested in creating works that were very defined their own spatial characteristics, which is one reason why I left the traditional theater, because it didn't accommodate that. You know, it wasn't interested in that kind of transformation. And it's because the economies are also, as we said, different. They're industrial in a certain way. So each project I do, I have to define the parameters of the environment, the way people sit, where the audiences are, what performance, all of those characteristics. So each work has to be reimagined for spaces that enable that to take place. So I also was trained in black boxes, you know. So the black box, there's an interesting tension discussed in the visual arts, which is very interesting also in the performing arts, the white box, black box model. The purity of the white box as a gallery space which is kind of neutral, which of course is total nonsense, it's absolutely not neutral at all. And the black box, where of course you can construct the world somehow, and so it's difficult and complex to design environments where you demand very specific spatial temporal conditions. Like this J&D project is difficult to show in museums, even though we showed it in the National Art Museum of China, and there were 3,000 people a day, but we had to shrink the timing of it, and so I'm very interested in taking the experience of the theater, which is I'm here for 2 hours, or in the case of German theater, I'm here for 6 hours, and I'm going to commit to that time, as opposed to thinking like I'm looking at a bunch of cereal on a shopping shelf. You know, I'm going to commit to that experience, and that's what theater and opera does, and dance does, right? Is that you are there, and if you're bored, it's really terrible because you have to stay. Unless you want to leave, which is hard. So you walk out a movie, but you can't do that in the theater. So when you create these new kinds of experiences, which have elements of theater and dance and visual arts and these Gesamtkunstwerk, as Wagner called them, you know, or these separations of work that have all these different elements operating together, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, and that's why I moved more into the so-called Ars Numérique, because that was the space that enabled these kinds of experiments to take place, because the theater didn't seem to be interested. As an institution, not as you see, the practice of the theater is very different than its institutional and its curatorial framework.
Last question.
Ok, merci beaucoup, Cheryl Sim. C'était un plaisir d'entendre ce survol. Okay, I'm going to just get on my tiptoes here. I was thinking in particular, no, it's okay, Davida. I was thinking in particular about the uses of screen and bodies and screens, and wondering if you might have some examples of works that launch a critical examination of the use of screen and bodies in space, because I was thinking about like works from the 50s, 60s, and 70s by Nan June Paik and Michael Snow and Bruce Nauman and Carolee Schneemann, and wondering if in this present context of the digital age, if we're actually also engaging with critical discourse.
Well, that's a fantastic question, Cheryl. Wow. I'll give you when you mentioned Bruce Nauman, I'll give you a personal experience. So my former collaborator in a group called Sponge that I founded in San Francisco in 1997 was Laura Faribault. Laura was the founder of a company called Snake Theater in the end of the 1960s with Chris Hardman, her partner, who then went on to found Antenna Theater, and she founded a company called Nightfire. And they were doing work in the Bay Area along with groups like George Coates and Soon 3, and these were big in the 80s and 90s. And they were coming from the visual arts, but they wanted to do performance because they were tired of they wanted to, of course they were tired of the object. They wanted to create these temporal, time-based experiences. And I'll get to the critical thing in a second. Laura saw at Nicholas Wilder's gallery Bruce Naumann's quarter piece in '64 or something, and she said that blew her away. Not only because of the technique, but because of this sudden critical experience of thinking about technology, of like seeing your body being cut up and never knowing how to deal with it. And this is, I think, the danger is the acceptance that the screen is a given, right? It's there, and therefore we have to use it. And Alain knows as well, a lot of VJ work is like wallpaper. It's like, okay, it's part of an ambient. It's not meant to be focused on and be criticized. And so it's really interesting to deal with that tension between a critical, political, social perspective, critiquing those actual tools that you're using. And that discourse is more prevalent curatorially in the so-called visual arts, and less so in the media arts, and or let's say, you know, the performing arts dealing with media. And it's an interesting question why that is. And part of it is perhaps this tension between immersion of leaving the critical faculties, Artaud, and Brecht, being aware that what you're watching is artifice and that it sets in front of you the world, and you have to make a decision or an opinion about what you see. And that's actually where I think right now in the mediated, you know, in this digital age, we're fighting, is that line between critical distance and saying the world is wrong this way, or I'm going to make an opinion, even though Brecht said we can smoke cigars in the theater, and that's why we can make the decision, because we're aware that what we're seeing is fake, and at the same time being caught up in it. And I think that's the challenge of this, you know, age of screens and this age of immersion that we're in now, is to find the balance between decisions and having an opinion and being swept away.
Merci. Je terminerai. Ici, j'ai des programmes qui sont tout frais sortis de l'imprimeur de la Biennale. Donc, si certaines personnes en veulent,
oh oui,
voilà.
Et le livre de Chris, on va
Absolument.
le mettre sur le tableau aussi. Donc, Dovrat brûle. Je vais la laisser aller. Okay? Et il y a une question brûlante. She's really burning this question.
Very short.
Sure.
Nevertheless, yes, that we're talking about technical and experience. That was brilliant, but very visual. There is still a big question in me left regarding to the other forms of technologies and performance, such as the, for instance, Lynn Cook with sensors on the body, and the audio, Cardiff Miller audio tours, which are also very, very participatory in other spaces. And I experienced here a lot of conventional spaces, not only theater, and not so much other spatials, with sunsets and sunrise brick. So if you can reflect on it.
Maybe just a little short reflection, because it's really a comment.
Okay. Yeah, this is the problem of these kinds of presentations. You have a screen, and we don't have a subwoofer in this room that will produce under 20 hertz where your body will be moving. And in fact, actually, it is very strongly audiovisual, because that's also been Elektra's modus operandi, and that's fine. And it's also extremely, I mean, I'm working now with projects on haptics and smell, and it's extraordinarily difficult to work with the lower senses, as they're called, touch, smell, and taste, along with all the other senses, proprioception, temperature, equilibrium perception, the sense of your body organs being stretched. Those are all senses as well. That is the next frontier, you know. But that also takes you back, you know, as well. So.
Merci.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And we're hoping they'll be with us at lunchtime so you can keep it going. So a couple of very important housekeeping things, many questions about, we are going to the SAT tonight. So if you have tickets for the dinner, they're $40 and include the performance is going to be an immersive projection. And then the director of SAT will come and explain to us what an actual live performance feels like, show us videotape in the SAT. It's a 30-minute projection. You can still buy tickets for the projection. They'll be $10. But if you've signed up for the dinner, please see Leah. And if you haven't paid, pay her now. If you have paid, just say, here I am, all is good. We want to see if there's any open spaces. We have a waiting list for this dinner tonight already. Oh gosh.
So after, we're going to have a break. This is our break, as we keep talking at you. But just to know that, anyway, but after this break, we're going to be splitting into 2 rooms. So you get to choose between Salle 1, Salle 2. And
the second, Salle 2, is just right here. And yes, of course, you can flow back freely if you want to hear one in one room, another in another room. This is fine. So do take your headphones with you into the other room, but all of the headphones will stay here. Any questions? We're done. You can come and see us.